Well, thank you. It's an honor to be with you all today, speaking about this important topic. And there's a statement from C.S. Lewis that I think fits this topic well. He said this: Christianity is a statement which, if false, is of no importance. If true, is of infinite importance. The one thing it cannot be is moderately important. You see, if Jesus did not raise from the dead, then Christianity is false. If Jesus did rise, then it means that he is God and Christianity is true. So whether or not the resurrection happened is possibly the most important question of all time. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, it means he's not a prophet, he's not a good teacher, he's just a man, and Christians are guilty of worshiping a man instead of God. That's why Paul says their faith would be worthless. But if Jesus did rise, it validates his message. It validates his identity as the Son of God. It means he has the authority to speak on matters of life and death. So was the resurrection a hoax or was it true history? Well, in an ideal world, who do we want investigating this question? I would want the greatest detective of all time, Sherlock Holmes, to be investigating this question. Batman fans, don't at me on this. I think Sherlock is probably the greatest. Why? Well, because he is an amazing detective. He's insistent about the truth. How many fans of Sherlock Holmes do we have in the room here? Any fans? Raise your hand. Okay, a couple fans here and there. How many of you have seen the Robert Downey Jr. movies? Raise your hand. Not nearly enough. After this chapel, I have an assignment for you. Go watch that movie. The BBC series with Benedict Cumberbatch. Couple more. Okay. How about have anybody read the books from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle? Yes, some more book fans. I love it. Sherlock Holmes is a fantastic character because what he wants is just the facts. So what if Sherlock Holmes were to embark on the case of the missing Messiah? What sort of information would he find and what would he conclude? So with that, let's look at what's called the minimal facts case for the resurrection. And these are the facts that are agreed to by the vast majority of historians, regardless of their religious background. So you've got agnostic historians, atheist historians, Christian historians, Jewish historians, and they agree to a certain number of facts about the historical Jesus. Actually, a lot of facts. There's zero doubt that Jesus actually existed, was a real historical figure. And then there are several facts that are particularly relevant for today's discussion. So Jesus was dead on the cross. He was gone, seen, and reported. Dead, gone, seen, and reported. Let's look through each of these four facts, and then we'll discuss what hypothesis could best explain them. So first, Jesus was dead on the cross. Now, for those of you Sherlock fans who are big fans of the series, you know who might be coming in to suggest a very simple theory to explain it all away. That's right, it's Inspector Lestrade. And he comes in and he says, I've seen the movie The Princess Bride. And what if he was just mostly dead? What if he wasn't really dead on the cross? Well, that's called the apparent death theory. And it was accepted by some people for a while, and it's still popular today on the interwebs, but it has been completely thrown out by scholars. Why? Well, because for several reasons that we could talk about, but Dr. Mike Licona states that even an extreme skeptic like John Dominic Crossan says that Jesus was crucified is as sure as anything historical ever can be. Why? Well, one reason is that the Romans were experts at killing. They had been perfecting this art of crucifixion for centuries, and they knew what they were doing when they put criminals to death. And actually, those Roman centurions would face the death penalty themselves if they allowed a victim to escape. So, I mean, talk about a stressful work environment. You're going to make sure that the job gets done. So that is a very, very powerful reason, and historians are convinced that Jesus is dead on the cross, which is why it's admitted by virtually all historians. Fact number 2 is that Jesus was gone from the tomb. Now, most scholars agree that he was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in his personal tomb. And what's incredible is that 2/3 of historians, about 2/3, agree that the tomb was then empty 3 days later. Dr. Gary Habermas has recorded 23 historical arguments for the empty tomb, and we're going to go through each of them. We'll get you out of here in about 2.5 hours. Does that sound okay? Now, let's go through just one of the most convincing reasons. Actually, two of the most convincing reasons. The first reason is that the enemies of Jesus admitted that the tomb was empty. Instead of going to the tomb where the body was in the tomb and saying, look, here's this guy that you're claiming has risen from the dead, instead of doing that, what they did is they admitted that the tomb was empty, and then they gave a bad explanation for why. They said that the disciples stole the body. Now, Lestrade comes in with another theory, and he said, see, they just went and stole the body. Case settled. Well, hold your horses, Lestrade. This is an incomplete theory. You see, the cover story here admits the empty tomb and then just tries to come up with a bad explanation for why the tomb is empty. Imagine someone's on trial for murder and they say, well, the only reason I killed them is that they wouldn't stop taunting me. Right? That's an admission with a bad explanation. You've just admitted the main problem right there. And it's a similar example with the disciples stealing the body. They're admitting that the tomb is empty, and then they're giving a bad explanation, which is that the disciples would want to steal the body. The disciples didn't have a reason or a resource to be able to steal the body of Jesus, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. One more reason to believe that the tomb is empty is that the Gospels are embarrassing but honest. For those of you who are getting close to graduation and you might be applying for some jobs, let me just give you some free advice, okay? When you're building your resume, when you're putting in your application, don't include your most embarrassing stories, okay? Just don't do it. I know you want to talk about how you couldn't make it through algebra, so you had to have your 8-year-old sister help you through your assignments, but don't do that, okay? Why? Well, because they'll believe you. Right? If you put something embarrassing on your resume or on your application, they're going to believe you. Why? Because the goal of an application is to actually make yourself look as impressive as possible. To put all your accomplishments out there and say, hey, here's why you should hire me, or here's why you should let me into your school. But the goal of history is to report what actually happened, no matter how embarrassing it is. So one way that we can tell between an idealized fiction and history is whether or not it includes embarrassing details. And oh boy, let me tell you, the Gospels include all sorts of embarrassing details about the early church, right? Jesus was betrayed by one of his top inner circle disciples, Judas. The disciples all abandoned Jesus when this happened. Peter, the leader of the early church, denied Jesus 3 times. And on top of all of that, women were the first witnesses to the empty tomb. I mean, talk about embarrassing. Right now, ladies, don't panic. Okay, I'm all for that. I think that's a great thing, right? I'm all for women being witnesses to the empty tomb. But in that time, at that place, women were not viewed as reliable eyewitnesses. They were viewed as unreliable eyewitnesses. As the first century Jewish historian Josephus stated, but let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the frivolousness and gullibility of their sex. Ouch. So the only reason you would include that, though, is if you're trying to tell actual history. If it's embarrassing in that moment, fine. But they're going to say, look, this is the way it really happened. And so we're going to report it exactly the way it really happened. So that's another powerful reason to believe that this tomb was empty. So the question remains, where is this missing Messiah? That brings us to fact number 3, that he was then seen by the apostles. Now, there's agreement, again, amongst secular historians that the apostles were convinced that they had seen Jesus alive. And one reason for this is because they were willing to die for this belief. They were willing to die for the belief that Jesus had actually risen from the dead. Now, you might say, okay, aren't a lot of religious people willing to die for what they believe in? And the answer is yes, of course. But there's a difference here. Number one, it's different because there's a difference between hoping and knowing. The disciples were in a unique position to know whether or not they had actually seen the risen Christ. And then there's another difference, which is that it shows that they couldn't have been lying, right? No one is willing to die for something that they know is a lie. The disciples couldn't have stolen the body because when Peter's about to be crucified, he would have said, okay, whoa, guys, okay, I'm sorry, I'll recant. Uncle, please take it easy on me. But that's not what he said. That's not what any of the apostles said. Instead, they were willing to die for what they believed in. Now, Inspector Lestrade comes in with another one of his theories, and he says this: what if they were hallucinating? Maybe they just ate some moldy manna. Well, Watson, the medical man, chimes in here and says, sorry, Lestrade, that just won't do. You see, this theory has problems. Hallucinations can't be shared. As Lee Strobel likes to say, you can't say to somebody, how'd you like that dream I had last night? Right? That's not how dreams work. And in the same way, that's not how hallucinations work. Hallucinations are private occurrences that happen in our minds. Dr. Joseph Bergson has stated, hallucinations are private experiences. Hallucination hypotheses, therefore, are unable to explain the disciples' simultaneous group encounters with the resurrected Jesus. The variety and amount of the appearances of Jesus is not able to be adequately explained by individual hallucination. And no matter how powerful a hallucination is, I've never heard of one powerful enough to teleport a body outside of a grave. So we've still got that empty tomb to contend with. So Jesus was dead on the cross. His body was gone from the tomb. He was then seen by the apostles. And then this was all reported within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. Now, Lestrade comes in with one final theory. He said it's just a fanciful story that his followers came up with many years later, and none of them were even there. Well, sorry, Lestrade, that just won't do. You see, others have thought of this before. It's called the legendary hypothesis. And there's a problem because there are many early records that show belief in the resurrection. So let's examine one of these sources real quickly here, which is the creed found in 1 Corinthians 15, right before the passage that we heard read today. And this is the letter of Paul to the Corinthians, and he says this, "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, that he appeared to Peter, and then to the 12, and after that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all of the apostles." So the legend hypothesis would say something like this. Just an approximation, don't take this chart too literally. So the crucifixion happens around 33 AD, and then way later, people have the bright idea, what if that great moral teacher, what if Jesus didn't stay dead? But there's a problem. You see, Paul wrote the letter of 1 Corinthians about AD 55, pushing belief in the resurrection way back, all the way to here. But we can get closer than that because this was a creed that was passed on to Paul, a formal statement of beliefs of the church that scholars think that he got at the latest around 6 years after the crucifixion. So that pushes it all the way back to here, but we can go even better than that because this was a formal creed, a formal statement of beliefs, and that would have taken time to be formed into this formal statement. And so scholars believe that this creedal statement goes back to within months of the crucifixion. The earliest followers of Jesus were convinced that they had seen him alive and convinced that he had risen from the dead. So what explanation is best? Sherlock Holmes has collected all of this relevant evidence that Jesus was dead on the cross, that his body was gone from the tomb, that he was then seen, and then this was reported within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. In light of all of these facts, what is the most likely hypothesis to explain all of them? Is it the apparent death theory? Well, again, this is not medically possible, and it doesn't explain the transformation of the disciples. Could it be that the disciples stole the body? Again, they didn't have the motive, the means, or the opportunity to do something like that, and they were willing to die for their belief that Jesus has risen from the dead. Could it be that the disciples had just hallucinated this? Again, that's not how hallucinations work, and the tomb was empty. Now, all of these explanations are unlikely and can only begin to explain one or two of the facts. Instead, I think we should conclude with the explanation that explains all of the data, that Jesus actually rose from the dead. Now, is this a big claim? Absolutely. But it's one that seems to best explain the evidence. What should we do in light of this? Sherlock Holmes, after he's collected all of the evidence, does he just go home and say, oh, I'll have a cup of tea and I'll put it off for a few more decades and eventually I'll come to a conclusion? No, of course not. He's Sherlock Holmes. He's insistent on finding the evidence and finding a conclusion. And once he's found it, he is committed to it. And I think that we ought to do the same as well. This matters because Jesus claims to be the way, the truth, and the life, the foundation of all reality. In John 1:12 it says, "But to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God." Have you both believed that Jesus is the Messiah, the risen Christ, and have you received him as your Lord and Savior? If not, let me just encourage you today to follow the evidence wherever it leads. Investigate this question more. There's a book called The Case for Christ that I would encourage you, if you're interested in this topic more, to read that book and to investigate further. Thank you so much for your time.